Hey guys, how you all going? It's Rick here from Games Bandit. Hope you're doing well. For me, not doing too great on the recent news that has popped out of Atomic Mass Games with the end of development of Star Wars X-Wing and Star Wars Armada. The end of an era. How did we get here? In the last decade, we've gone from being the #1 miniature seller, usurping Warhammer at one point of time, to in less than a decade, pretty much no longer going to be a product line that's going to be punching out any new ships, scenario packs, product, etc., etc. It's no longer going to be supported. There's a lot to unpack in this video, in my opinion. I'm going to be taking it all the way back from 2012 to the present, what we went from to how we got here. What are the implications from a store point of view as well? Because the last week has been really interesting for me. I have sold more Star Wars Armada than in the history of being in GameSpan, which makes absolutely no sense. I could literally take a photo of 6 or 7 items left on the shelf for Star Wars Armada, which is mind-boggling because for the last few months or year or so, I haven't been able to move next to anything, which is absolutely insane. So a lot to unpack, a lot to kind of mull over. I want to talk about that. Want to talk about the legacy, what the community's doing, what are the implications for Atomic Mass Games and Star Wars in general as an intellectual property. We're going to unpackage all of that like we always do in these vids, but going from the top, so what's actually happened? We've got this announcement from Atomic Mass Games just pretty much officially announcing they're going to end development of Star Wars X-Wing and Star Wars Armada. However, there's going to be a little bit more support still coming from the game in terms of organized play, which is usually like scenario kits or championships held at stores or OP play centers or community centers, etc., etc. And that in the Open World Championship Adepticon, there are going to be events in 2025. Will there be more support beyond that? Don't have a magic crystal ball. Who really knows? Anything can happen. Anything can flow. So let's go all the way back to 2012, where it began. I'm going to be using ICV2's graphs here because they're absolutely phenomenal. They've captured the sales in terms of, you know, all the communications they had with distributors, retailers, etc., etc., and pulling all their information together. So here's a bit of a timeline. Fantasy Flight Games pops up, and they announce in 2012 Star Wars X-Wing. It gets released, and straight out of the gate, it's the second highest selling game. And while I'm going to be referencing these graphs, they're specifically talking about the US, but I believe the US kind of captures the world view as well. So I think this is a pretty good gauge upon what may have been happening in the rest of the world, Oceanic, Europe, etc., etc. It may not be exactly like for like, but it's a pretty good gauge. So what happens? 2012, the top 5 collectible, non-collectible miniature line games in this space. We've got Warhammer 40k. Never been usurped, never been dethroned, always been the #1 seller in the space of miniature games for as long as we know, from the time that man started to the present. Riveting stuff. Star Wars X-Wing pops up as #2. Now, people are going to say, straight out of the gate, any game that has an intellectual property of Star Wars is going to do well. The real test is the next year. Is it still going to be selling? Is it still going to be a top shelf item that's going off the shelves? And the answer is yes. The next year, 2013, Warhammer is still #1. And then Star Wars X-Wing is just behind it in #2. So it's consistently up there. It's making a name for itself. It's doing really well. 2024. Nothing much has changed. We've got Warhammer and we've got Star Wars. So now we've got a litmus test for over 2 years to kind of convey that that this is the real McCoy. This is the real deal. People are here to play. They're enjoying the game. And something interesting happens in 2015. Bang! 2015 comes along and Star Wars X-Wing usurps Warhammer. Never been done before. Couldn't believe it. This game was the highest selling game for a miniature game in the world at one point of time. In less than 10 years ago, we're reporting this video in 2024, in less than 10 years ago, Star Wars X-Wing was the top highest selling game. Fantasy Flight Games ticked a box, were on a bit of a roll, and not only that, but they extended their resourcing to also developing another game which they launched in 2015 and made it into the top 5 list, let alone the top 3 list, was Star Wars Armada. Star Wars Armada and Star Wars X-Wing, while they're kind of, strategical, dogfighting games, Star Wars X-Wing was a lot more intuitive when you picked it up. It was rudimentary. You could probably pick up a game, teach someone beers and pretzels at your local pub, and pretty much get a vibe from anyone that they could pick it up and play it on their own accord after one game. Star Wars Armada had a bit more of a tighter niche, a little bit more complex, a little bit more slower in terms of its gameplay, but it was more methodical. You really had to think out each move that little bit more longer than you would in Star Wars X-Wing. And I think Star Wars Armada, and the biggest difference I noticed in my experience was if you make a mistake in Star Wars Armada, whether that be overshooting or undercalculating a move, you're pretty much cooked for the rest of the game. It's hard to come back. Whereas Star Wars X-Wing always had that balancing factor of, even though I've made the wrong move, I can always come back from the position I'm in. And we've seen many games, even at the highest levels, where competitors have been able to do that. So Fantasy Flight Games is pretty much on cloud 9 right now. Top 3 sellers and displacing Warhammer still in that space. Absolutely phenomenal. But the next year, Star Wars X-Wing is still at the top of its game. Armada slides slowly off that list, which isn't a big concern. As I said, it was a bit more of a niche. Star Wars X-Wing and Armada had that weird thing that they would have been cannibalizing their own player base. They are both Star Wars dogfighting games. They're both the same intellectual property. You would have had guys that would have played both, but usually you'd invest more in one over the other, which is another point we'll talk about very shortly. So going further down the track, we're going into 2017. Again, Star Wars X-Wing is still up there. So we've got 3 years of being the #1 seller. In addition to that, from its 2012 to the present, 5 years later, it's selling through the roof. It's killing it. Something interesting happens in 2018. The game takes a little bit of a hit. Fantasy Flight Games announces another game, another miniature game in the Star Wars intellectual property, which was Star Wars Legion, and Legion absolutely goes off without a hitch either. And one of the points that we're going to be talking about much later in this video is about the cannibalization of displacing other Star Wars games, which is an interesting point with the recent release of Shatterpoint displacing Legion as a result. So we've got a little bit of a history where, and you can see it at the lowest level of entry point or where people play. If you go to your local store, and I'm sure, if you're playing regularly on the week to week, there would have been people who would have been playing Star Wars X-Wing that when Legion came across said, I'm going to try Star Wars Legion. And they may have got hooked and they may have continued to play that game. And you would have found that they would no longer be purchasing or buying into both platforms because it's just too expensive. They don't have all the time in the world. And I see that all the time in my Games Bandit sales, is that once I have a customer that transitions into a completely different game, even though they're a regular customer who used to buy, Star Wars X-Wing and whatever it was, once they move over, generally they no longer tend to invest in the other game. And they're either, and I've noticed this in this particular industry, is usually I find customers are dedicated to one line. And, that's kind of the rule. It's not the exception. The exception are there are some people out there who will buy into all the Star Wars varying lines, but they're usually few and far in between and probably make up about 5% of the customer base. 1 in 20 people, to be honest. So, going back here, Star Wars Legion comes out 2018. X-Wing takes a little bit of a hit. We've got a few other, games coming up. Games Workshop gets Age of Sigmar out as well, 40k, and they take back the throne of being the top miniature seller in the world, which, isn't that big of a point. They're still doing really well with Star Wars X-Wing. Next year comes along. Star Wars Legion actually usurps X-Wing. So we don't see any movement between the top 5 from one year to the next. All we see is a slight movement of X-Wing on the downtrend. But in saying that, in 2019, anyone who went to the World Championship in Minnesota would have told you the game was thriving. There were regular ships coming out. There was a launch of another faction, which was the Resistance. and Separatist came out, the Clone Wars came out. The game was doing very well in this period either way. It was still a top seller, and you could go to pretty much any of your local scenes, your community centers, and you could pick up a game and play without an issue. In 2019, I went to 5 different regional championships in New South Wales, and all of them had over 50 players. So it was very healthy. The game was doing really well. 2020 pops along, and something interesting kind of happens in this space is that Atomic Mass Games pops up with a brand new game called Marvel Crisis Protocol. It's its own studio. However, it's owned by Asmodee. People are going to always correct me. We say Asmodee in Australia, but Asmodee has a completely different miniature studio which launches a new game called Marvel Crisis Protocol. And it's actually a very good game, a good, entry into that point that hadn't been done before. Well, not to the extent that it was done. And between now, since its launch in, 2020 to the present, it has just under 100 releases. If I could show you, you can see this in the back from A to Z, all the way along this shelf, has one of each of the respective releases. It's got a full library, and usually each month or each second month, you can find up to 2 to 3 different releases. Very healthy game. Guys have invested a phenomenal launch, and they've supported it really well, and it's continuing to go. Each and every quarter, we're finding bigger and better releases, and to this date, been a solid seller. Star Wars Legion pops down to number 4, and the Age of Sigmar pops back down to 5, and then we've got no more Star Wars X-Wing in this list. It pretty much vanishes, and something interesting happens at this time is that Asmodee they have a restructure. There's some people who will let go from Fantasy Flight Games. Fantasy Flight Games is going to remain, but it's going to be focusing on like your cardboard and other games of that likes, whereas the new studio under Atomic Mass Games is now going to actually absorb Star Wars Legion, Star Wars Armada, Star Wars X-Wing, as well as its new creation Star Wars Protocol. Pretty big thing for a new studio to undertake with completely new people at the helm. Even though they were a branch of different, people who've had many years of experience across the industry, but a completely new studio takes on some of the existing IPs while also creating their own IP. And what we tend to see from here is that the following year in 2021, Atomic Mass Games does hold number 4 and 5th spot with Protocol and Legion, but Star Wars X-Wing and Armada kind of drop off the face of the earth. In late 2020, there was an announcement walking into 2021 that the Clone Wars was being released, and so they had the Separatist starter fleet, the Republic starter fleet, and 2 other additional ships that you could buy for each of those factions. They had just started this flow of new factions, which usually people buy into those factions. They're very popular, and what we've noticed in Legion and in X-Wing is that when they announced the Clone Wars were going to be part of their product lines, new people seemed to jump into the fray. More sales were being made than they ever had in the history of promoting any of their games over the years. And so it was such a weird thing for Star Wars Armada to walk into the Clone Wars, open up that pipeline, but not really take much advantage of it, because once that was done, Atomic Mass Games took the reins and they announced, per this screenshot right here, as we move into 2022 and beyond, we're excited to continue to support a Star Wars Armada by prioritizing reprinting existing products and through organized play. However, we currently do not have any new Armada products in development, which was crazy because I'm sure at the time of the launch of the Star Wars Armada Clone Wars, they probably would have had a lot of things down in the pipeline that just ended up fizzling out or being moved under Atomic Mass Games. They were prioritizing, Marvel Crisis Protocol, as well as, you know, Star Wars Legion, etc., etc. And so, from there, the game's kind of fizzled out. And if we go to 2023, which is the most recent information, we get a new game being launched called Star Wars Shadowpoint by Atomic Mass Games. So all of a sudden, Atomic Mass Games have created a new game, Marvel Crisis Protocol, recently, and they've also created Star Wars Shadowpoint, but have also absorbed 3 existing properties or product lines. Seem to be a lot for them to kind of handle, to be honest, looking at it retrospectively. In my opinion, what would have happened was that from the investment firm point of view, from Asmodee's point of view, they would have been reviewing financially what has been doing well and what's not doing well, what's costing us money, what's making us the most amount of money, and they made financial decisions to cut Star Wars X-Wing and Star Wars Armada and gut them out and move forward with Star Wars Protocol and Shadowpoint, and then also continue Legion because it's got enough of a fan base, enough turnover to be profitable to continue there on in. The question that keeps always coming up, and this was at the Gamma Expo by the same people who put those charts together as part of their PowerPoint presentation, does Shadowpoint displace other Star Wars games? And this was also presented, or a question that was raised at PAX as well. And at PAX, I can't confirm what the comment was made at Gamma Expo, but at PAX, the comment that was made at that time was that basically, no, it doesn't, because they're all completely different games. And I know that's complete baloney, because like I said earlier in this video, when you go to your local Play Store or your community center, I know pretty much anyone and everyone, 90% of the people will either play one or the other game. They generally don't tend to buy into both, and you'll find that they're cannibalized from a former game. The guys who I used to play Star Wars X-Wing with, a lot of them moved on to Legion. And a lot of the people who were then moving on to Legion then moved on to Shadowpoint, if they didn't already move on to Marvel Crisis Protocol. When Shadowpoint got released, it also cannibalized Marvel Crisis Protocol because it was such a similar game, it's just that the property was different. So, I would have found that running 5 product lines that were very similar to each other, they're very different games, don't get me wrong, but they're miniatures, 4 of them are Star Wars, 1 of them's Marvel. I think you've got a bit of a fight for yourself where you're going to be cannibalizing your own population of gamers in that drift. And I can tell you for a fact is that any of those people that would have been going down would have said the exact same thing. One of the interesting things that was presented along in that PowerPoint presentation by ICV2 at the Gamma Expo was the non-collectible miniature games market. From 2018 to 2023, it's pretty much doubled. In the last 5 years, it's doubled, which is crazy. The fact that we've had COVID, the fact that we've had interest rates, we're kind of in a recession, we're not in a recession, depending upon which government you talk to. Inflation has gone through the roof. Regardless of all that, miniatures are selling better now than they ever had in the past, which you wouldn't think to date, given the fact that Star Wars X-Wing and Armada are no more. But I honestly believe, as I'd mentioned earlier, it was purely a financial decision where people were reviewing P&Ls or profit and losses and seeing how much money they were making versus how much money they were costing us, and then evaluating what they wanted to do in that space with other potential pipelines for games like Marvel Crisis Protocol and Star Wars Legion, as well as Star Wars Shadowpoint, and they moved forward with those ones. I don't know if that's a matter of a fact. It's not like their P&Ls are public information. It's a private investment firm. So we may never know. We may never find out. In 2020, as part of the Star Wars X-Wing, re-ownership under the new publisher of Atomic Mass Games, they did a soft relaunch of the product itself. They relaunched it from Star Wars X-Wing 2.0 to officially Star Wars X-Wing 2.5. It was quite a bit of a transition, if I don't say myself. We went from having a dogfighter game, which was squadron based. You brought your squadron, I brought my squadron. We started on one side of the table, you started on the other side of the table. Both of our lists usually accumulated to 200 points. We would go head to head. And then at the end of, 75 minutes or however long it was, we'll evaluate who still has more ships or more points, or if you're eliminated from being on the board altogether, that would decide the winner. To now being more scenario based, where you would play capture the flag, you could play whoever holds the center the most, or whoever holds this particular objective the most, etc., etc. The game changed from being that chess setup to being something completely different that we hadn't really seen in this miniature product line before. Somewhat similar to how Marvel Crisis Protocol started to come out with its scenario-based gameplay. Obviously, whenever you bring quite a bit of change to anything, you're going to get some people who aren't the biggest fans, and you're going to get some of the existing community who do actually love all the changes you're implementing. And what we had found was that from a store point of view, going a little bit off tangent here, is that I found that we were seeing less and less ships being pushed or being created or being developed, which is one of the product selling points, because for me, as not only a store owner but as a player, I want to see more and more ships. I want to see all the different ships and all the variety my faction can have as the resistance. How can I build my squadron differently? Give me more, give me more. Whereas what we started to see was the release and repackaging of scenario packs. The Battle of Endor, which was a little bit more casual than competitive. It was about you setting up against a friend on a particular scenario. You'd play based on whatever the story was behind each of these. And it just, to be honest, it felt very shallow. While I think there may have been a lot of time invested in creating these new scenarios, doing the arts for it, I think development of actual pieces, getting them play tested, requires a lot more involvement. So it kind of felt like at that time period there was a bit of an olive branch to try to say that we're continuing this game by bringing out scenario packs, when essentially the, under the hood of any miniature game is the actual pieces that make up the game itself. So it kind of felt like for the last handful of years, we were already transitioning to that phase of not having the greatest product line of support, and I could feel it. As a store who would sell Star Wars Armada and Star Wars X-Wing, we were selling less and less and less over time. Generally speaking, your highest sale of any product is when it's initially launched in a month, and then 2 months, and 3 months. And then what may happen is that you may find another ship that gets released. Not only does that ship do well, but it also has synergy with an existing ship that you also need for your army or your squadron. And so that old ship that you would have is now actually, part of the meta that's come out, and people start buying into it. But because we weren't seeing new ships come out supporting some of the older ships, the sales across X-Wing depleted very quickly. Same as Armada, because they had officially announced we're no longer developing new pieces on the board. It just kind of hit a massive halt, where I had shelves and shelves and shelves. I've literally got cabinets of this stuff that just hasn't moved in years. Absolutely sucks. Even at a wholesale price or just below wholesale, I couldn't move some of these items at all. That was until recently they completely announced, per this announcement at the front, we're no longer going to be developing either game. So what ended up happening was, out of nowhere, Armada specifically, X-Wing didn't move, Armada specifically started to have a few different sales of items that were already considerably in scarcity across, the region, and people were buying into them. And as you can see, there is some stuff going on eBay. This had 2 days left. It's at 400 US. It's a Venator. We've got 40 bids for Another vendor for 5 days and 21 hours. Like this is stuff that should have been selling for like 110, 120, if that are now selling for almost double, triple, quadruple, and will continue to go down that phase. And so as a store, I looked at the distributor website and I was kind of watching it, and I didn't make any additional orders myself, but I was trying to see if there was a trend of specific items that were vanishing from the distribution level, and that's what absolutely happened. Stuff that had 40 and 50 in stock at the nation's distributor level vanished overnight, like quickly just popped off. Now, whether that was different collection of people going up to their local store or to their local, retailer and saying, can you please order this in as the game's no longer cancelled and I want to make sure I get it before it goes out of print. And then they quit, people were ordering as that happened, or whether one or two or three stores saw an opportunity to quickly buy into something that's no longer going to be printed, to hold all the stock and then to sell it at whatever price they can get for it, because it's going to come down to supply and demand. There will be some pieces out there that will have extremely low demand, irregardless, because of how they're entered into the meta and that they're not that useful, but there will be some items that are core components that you need for Star Wars Armada that evidently are going to be doing extremely well, which is absolutely insane. So I think what we're going to see is that some stores are going to be making some considerable amount of profit for Star Wars Armada. I think you're going to find that the secondhand market, there will be items that will be going for a lot more now than that they would have a month ago or would have 2 years ago, which is insane to be saying. However, in my read of all this, and this is someone who's just observing the space from afar, who's not actually invested other than the cupboards that I already have for both X-Wing and now, to a lesser extent, Armada, I think that the hot market will be now for the next 2 to 3 weeks. And then I think after that, in 6 or 7 months, we'll see those prices start to completely ice down, if not earlier. I think this is people just trying to jump in. I do think that there's a considerable amount of this product floating around the country. It's just opened already. This isn't something that's a collectible item that you put up on a shelf and you kind of hold in there for long term. That's like a display item or like a Pokemon card or anything like that. This is just something that you would open for your new game. In conclusion, and what only can be described as a modern day tragedy, because that's what effectively this is. From number 1 on the plateau, number 3 respectively, Star Wars X-Wing, Star Wars Armada, less than 10 years ago, less than a decade ago. The tippity top of the mountain to where they are today. It hurts. As an individual, having a competitive outlet in Star Wars dogfighting. Fantastic. World Championships were amazing. Oofed. The lifelong friends I made. I had a whole table at my wedding, in fact, of people that I met purely through Star Wars X-Wing. I've made lifelong friends that I can tell you about. Guys that I go to the football with today that I met through Star Wars X-Wing. Season memberships. Ooh. And as a store point of view, let me tell you this, ladies and gentlemen. Without Star Wars X-Wing and Star Wars Armada, there would be no Games Bandit. We purely existed because of the cross paths that X-Wing had in my life and the fact that I loved the game that much. Star Wars X-Wing and Star Wars Armada were the priority, were the flagships of Games Bandit when we launched. Without this, there would be no Games Bandit. I've said it and I can't say it again. But it is what it is, and as they've highlighted here over the past few years, rising production costs, global manufacturing, and pandemic-related challenges have made it increasingly difficult to produce high-quality, pre-painted miniatures, which ultimately led to the decision to end development. It is what it is, and all good things have to eventually come to an end, unfortunately.